resume our analysis of Freud's political and social theory by turning now primarily to his classic text, Civilization and Its Discontents. But first of all, let's summarize the problem when we compare Freud with Marx. For both of them, we have an acute difficulty. That is, that the human predicament, as seen by Freud and Marx, is suffering from a severe malady. That malady is called the alienated split self, and that simply means a divided self, a self that is so torn by conflicting desires or needs that it's in a state of chronic suffering. The personality then in conflict, a common theme of the 19th and 20th centuries, but Freud and Marx bring to it a thoughtful, controversial, profound dialogue that we want to try to capture. We're divided within ourselves between conflicting sets, then, of expectations and aspirations. The question is, what is the cause of the conflict? Well, we lack consciousness, both Freud and Marx would say, of who we are, of why we're in such a painful state of alienation. What are we alienated from? Well, from Marx's point of view, we're alienated from our essence, that is, from what he calls our species being, our best selves. We are striving to become the person that we need and want to be, but historically we're not quite there yet. If we could find a system, i.e. the communist system, that would reinforce, bring out, elicit all of our best qualities, then we'd be able to reach this species being mentality or consciousness. Freud believes that a profound alienation pervades our personality, but basically it's a twofold alienation. We are alienated within ourselves, in the human personality, of the id from the superego, as well as alienation of both from the ego. And let's look at that more carefully because it was the theme of the first lecture in part on Freud, but let's try to summarize or clarify what that means. That is, the two key powers in the personality, as we saw, are those of the id, that is the aggressive power of the unconscious, and the superego, that is the power of guilt and of the ego ideal or the high expectations that are set for us by our parents and by society. There's a terrible struggle going on between these two forces within us, that is the id demanding satisfaction and the superego, the second most important or most powerful force in the personality, insisting that those demands cannot be met, and then punishing the id as much as possible and using that force of punishment for the id's aggressive and demanding ways. That's one conflict. It is an irremediable conflict within the personality. But then the other source of alienation or of conflict is of both the id and the superego together from reason, from the ego. The ego is strengthened by being in touch with external reality, but it unfortunately is the weakest source within the personality, and so therefore not in the alienation. That is, the ego, the external reality, the ego's appeals to the superego, all cannot contain the enormously powerful force of the id's unconscious. If this is Freud's account of the human predicament against Marx's account, then what remedies do they both see for the alienation? Well, from Marx's point of view, there is an optimistic prognosis That is, he has diagnosed the problem to be the capitalist system, and therefore the prognosis is that historically the capitalist system will fail, and we will find the evolution, the development of a whole new kind of society, a society that will allow us to understand our universal identity with one another, barriers that separate us, such as religion and nationalism, will fall, and we will understand our species consciousness, our species being. And Marx would say then that time is definitely on our side. We'll grow out of adolescence, and the remedy is history. For Freud, this prognosis is wrong, and his own prognosis of what will happen is at best guarded. The remedy that he sets forth is analysis. He is the author, the founder of psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis is open only to a few. The masses will probably continue on their destructive paths and perhaps destroy us all. Alienation, then, is inevitable among the vast majority. From Freud's point of view, conflict is destructive and not constructive. Marx would say that at times class conflict can hasten the movement of history and therefore be constructive. From Freud's point of view, it's wholly destructive. We strive not to cure, not to overcome, but to contain, to cope. And as we'll see in a moment, in Civilization's Discontents, certain coping mechanisms are set forth. In this struggle, then, coping with the suffering that surrounds us, with the inner conflict, the very best solution that we can find is analysis. An analysis that can skillfully, professionally strengthen our ego, our powers of reason. And that is our last best hope. For Marx and Freud, together we can confront the problem of alienation then best by raising our consciousness. Marx would say joining the Communist Party or something like it that is a progressive political organization that would hasten the movement of history insofar as that can be done. From Freud's point of view, we can raise our consciousness to some extent through analysis. But Freud is at odds with Marx in terms of the economic versus the psychological factors involved. That is, Marx is basically an economic determinist, and he believes that the economy may be able to rescue us in one way or another as it develops into a fully species-being communist economy. That will raise our consciousness ultimately, but no amount of consciousness raising now is going to produce the communist or the new economy that he wants. That can be done only by history. A certain historical moment is necessary in order to usher in this ideal economic state. From Marx's point of view, then only a class revolution at the right time can provide the remedy, and that will bring in the consciousness raising that is so crucial. Freud, by contrast, is not an economic but a psychological determinist who believes that the unconscious remains the key determinant of our behavior. It is within us then determined, but the catch is that even though the source of determinism is within us, that is within the conscious, within the unconscious sphere, we cannot know it. And that is the difficulty. Our ego is besieged, it's embattled, it's weak compared to the id and the superego, but it is the ego that is unable to shape our consciousness. And we try at best to strengthen it, but even at best we can know only a small amount of our tiny fraction of that vast reservoir of determining forces within us called the unconscious. So we strive to reinforce our ego so that we'll not cave in and surrender to a runaway id. But this is difficult because there is not only the runaway id, there are the terrible forces of guilt and ideal expectations that confront us at every corner. It's a grim story from Freud's point of view. And well, it might be grim because as we're turned again to Civilization as Discontents, we must note that Freud was writing this in 1929 at a terrible time of his life. That is, there were several factors contributing to his own personal misery, and the pessimism that flows from Civilization as Discontents follows logically from the system that he just set forth, but it also follows, understandably, from Freud's own personal experiences during the decade before he wrote Civilization as Discontents in 1929. First of all, there was Freud's personal horror at the bloodshed and senseless brutality that he witnessed in World War I. Everything that he saw during that immensely tragic theater of war that occurred disillusioned him, sent him into despair. After that, his disillusionment by 1929 with the Bolshevik Revolution was complete because he had seen that drift into Stalinism and into hideous aggression. He was a Jew at this time in Vienna and witnessing the rise of Hitler, the popularity in Germany of the Nazis. Then there was his sense of financial insecurity. Freud was an extremely perspicacious individual. He could foresee on the horizon not the enormity of the Great Depression that would occur soon after he completed Civilization as Discontents, but he certainly had some inkling of the financial mess that was ahead. And then perhaps most of all, there is his struggle with his personal illness of cancer. He was suffering at this moment with cancer of the mouth that had first been diagnosed in the early 20s, only a few years before, and it's now causing him severe pain and, as a physician, acute anxiety knowing what is ahead. And within the next decade, it would kill him. So we have then so many personal reasons why Freud should be in despair. It seems if any one of those factors could plunge an individual into a sense of disillusionment, that would be enough. But he faced all of them, and he was intelligent enough as a thinker to understand the crisis that the world was in, as well as his own personal crisis. It's with that background, then, that we continue our analysis of Civilization as Discontents. And if you remember from the first lecture, we were talking about the degree of suffering that he sees not only in part, in his own part, but also throughout humankind. That is, the way in which suffering comes from three directions: from the physical decay of the human body, the kind of suffering that he as a cancer patient is now experiencing. And then after that, the suffering that the fates bring us, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And then finally, the suffering caused as a result of our everyday expected interaction with others, given the fact that there is so much aggression and so much pain. Well, as a result of the suffering that's part, then, of the human condition, Freud outlines in Civilization as Discontents a number of coping mechanisms that he doesn't recommend, but as a realist, he describes. This is the way people strive, then, to contain the suffering, to in some way cope with what they find around him. And he says in Civilization as Discontents that the first of these, the most obvious, is a chemical solution, that is, intoxication. We strive then for the crudest kind of palliative that we know, and that is the drowner of cares, as he calls it. This solution is only a very temporary one, and it causes injury if indulged in too much. At best, he calls it a useless waste of a large quota of energy. The second coping mechanism after using alcohol is using isolation. That is one of the key forms of suffering that he describes, so he said, is just interaction with other people. Well, we can become a hermit. We can exclude ourselves from our environment and seek then some solace in solitude, in continuing solitude. That, from Freud's point of view, is only, again, a very temporary solution, and if at best only a solution for a few, if they simply decide to cop out of humanity. Well, the third type of coping mechanism to which he devotes most time is sublimation. And sublimation is defined as a way of finding socially acceptable responses and releases for one's aggression. As, for example, in sports, especially contact sports, where one can let it all hang out, say, on the ball field. But Freud discusses, in this context of sublimation, several different forms of sublime expression, that is, of aggressive energy that is sanctioned by society as worthwhile or respectable. And first, there's work, particularly the work, as he says, of the artist or the scientist, that's highly valued by society. We find relief in that. And he says this psychical and intellectual kind of work, the artist's joy in creating or scientists in solving problems or discovering truths, is a way of sublimating the drives, the aggression that we find within us. But he says work is only a mild solution for our aggressive drives, because after all, most work doesn't do that. It doesn't satisfy us at all, as Marx had pointed out. And then even if we get the most satisfaction from our work, the feeling that we have of satisfaction is mild as compared, Freud says, with that derived from the sating of crude and primary instinctual impulses. We're talking about now venting our aggression. And even if we can imagine, say, as a professional ball player going into a World Series game and hitting a Grand Slam home run at just the right moment, and all the satisfaction that comes from slamming that ball, nevertheless, from Freud's point of view, the intensity of satisfaction is mild compared to taking a baseball bat and whacking your worst enemy over the head with it. That really gives you a sense of satisfaction. So sublimation, then, is mild and available only to a few. For work to be satisfactory, it has to be, Freud says, freely chosen and professional. After the use of work as a way of releasing our energies, there is art. Freud says that we can enter into the world of fantasy in art or in films or in some other enjoyment of this kind. That's only, Freud says, a temporary narcosis. It's a way of managing for a while to allow us to enter into this escape. It cannot be forever. We can go into a film, lose ourselves for a couple of hours, but then we have to return to this world of suffering. Freud, interestingly, analyzes religion as a form of sublimation. And he says that religion offers a protection against suffering through a delusional remolding of reality. It's made by a considerable number of people in common. The religions of mankind, he says, must be classed among the mass delusions of this form of sublimation. So we can enter into religion, this world of, again, like art, fantasy, but it is delusional. And Freud's point is, therefore, that both art and religion are great escapes. Art, including film, offers us through fantasizing momentary relief from reality. Religion can offer us a more serious, long-term relief from reality into a world of illusion, but neither one of them is going to be satisfactory. Freud's indicating then the way in which we're struggling in the midst of this human predicament to find some relief, some form of release from the pain that is all around us. If not through work, if not through art, if not through religion, then what about love? He analyzes love as a way of release. And he says that sexual love gives us our most intense experience of an overwhelming sensation of pleasure in our search for happiness. And romantic love, to enter into this world of romance, is a perfect example of sublimation. Love, after all, is at heart just lust. It's aggressive energy, but it can become, through romance, sublime. And so we call it not lust, but love. He says that the problem is that the weak side of this technique of living is easy to see. Otherwise, no human being would have thought of abandoning this path of happiness for any other. We'd all seek out love. But the weak side is that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so seriously unhappy as when we have lost our loved object or its love. A sad comment, then, on this form of sublimation. And later on in his discussion of love, he said that because people have understood and experienced this, and that is they're miserable when the object of their love is lost, whether through death or unfaithfulness. And in that misery, they can't stand it anymore, and so some people seek out another way of expressing their love, and that is loving all men, or loving all being. And he cites the example of St. Francis, who is not into lust or sexual expression, but rather into loving even the birds. And that has this to commend it. That is, St. Francis can say that he loves all people and all animals, and there's no likelihood of all people and all animals vanishing. You'll always have something to love. And in that satisfaction, then, of finding release, St. Francis and others who accept this idea of universal love, they can find consolation. Freud says that he has two main objections to this view of St. Francis, that we can love everybody. One, a love that does not discriminate seems to me to forfeit a part of its own value by doing an injustice to its object. That is, it demeans love to say that we love the birds. And we can love the birds as well as, for example, our spouse or our partner. And secondly, not all people are worthy of love, Freud the realist says. So this then is the reality. In desperation, we're trying to find coping mechanisms that will relieve us from the pain, the suffering that's everywhere around. Work, art, religion, love, romance, and everywhere there are problems. This is inherent in the human predicament. This then is the reality, exposed by Freud, the supreme realist. But it gets even worse. And that is, if it were not bad enough that the collective id is always within us and tormenting us with these aggressive energies, the collective force of civilization burdens us with awful guilt when we don't meet the expectations of that collective force. And so civilization represents a mass or a collective superego that is certainly not concerned with reality, but only with the task of imposing harsher and harsher moral codes on this mass id, this aggressive force that is causing us so much misery. The problem is that when this great contest between the mass collective id and the mass collective superego, when these two forces meet, they only make the situation worse because both are equally irrational. Religion in particular takes the idea of love and uses it for its own purpose. As Freud says, it sets up an impossible moral demand. One of the ideal demands, Freud says, of civilized society is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. This is known throughout the world, is undoubtedly older than Christianity, which puts it forth as its proudest claim. And Freud, in a very humorous part of Civilization's Discontents, asks, how can this be? Why should we love our neighbor as ourself? What if our neighbor is a stranger that has nothing in common with us? Why should we love that stranger? Why should we, especially if the stranger is very mean to us? And yet, Freud says, there's a second commandment, which seems to me even more incomprehensible and arouses still stronger opposition in me. It's also what the great world religions say, not just love thy neighbor as thyself, but love thine enemies. And Freud says, what more preposterous, absurd, ideal commandment than this might we have? So, the mass force of civilization is trying irrationally to cope with a mass aggressive id by insisting that the id must not rape thy neighbor, which one wants to do, but rather love thy neighbor. And the absurdity of this, from Freud's point of view, is particularly evident when we see the reality of human nature itself and the fact that it is so uncontainable. He says the element of truth behind what all that I've been saying is that which people are so ready to disavow, is that men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved and who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and to kill him. Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. And Freud says, who, in the face of all of his experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion? Well, of course, the world's religions have a courage to dispute it by insisting that in the face of this, that is, that we are savagely out to harm one another, as we did in the First World War and after. In the face of this, they will say, love thine enemy, this impossible command. Now, Freud specifically attacks Marxism, not as one of the world religions, but as one of the secular religions that fantasizes about the elimination of aggressiveness to achieve a communist society. The communists believe, Freud says, that they found the path of deliverance from our ills. And then he goes on to summarize in a marvelous way Marx's argument. Marx's argument being that if only we could change the system, then the self will follow. Freud argues we are the system. That is, we comprise the system. How can it be that if we change the system, everything will be peace and harmony, sweetness and light? It can't be. The problem is within us, within the constitution of the human personality. Aggressiveness, Freud says, was not created by property. And if we do away with property, as Marx says, we'll still have aggression, because aggression forms the basis of every relation of affection and love among people. There is nothing, no act of humanity that is free of the lustful act of domination, that is, the desire to aggress or to harm others. In one of, I think, his most compelling passages, he says, it is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. In this respect, the Jewish people, scattered everywhere, have rendered most useful services to the civilizations of the countries that have been their hosts. But unfortunately, all the massacres of the Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that period more peaceful and secure for their Christian fellows. Freud dies in 1939, but he, with his perspicacity, could easily have foreseen the Holocaust. not only have foreseen it, but he would have understood it. He would not have been surprised.